So I will go ahead and dive in for a little bit of context. This is a little bit kind of different from um, Michelle and Richard's talks in that I really decided to just kind of focus on three major areas where I sort of where my own work has moved towards really kind of reform and transformative change in terms of mental health services. Um, but just to say a little bit about myself, all of my research, and in the US, we don't actually have consumer academic roles. That's a kind of a non-existent phenomena, sadly, still in the US. So I am just in a kind of a standard academic research position, and my work very much involves kind of championing lived experience integration, participatory methods, and the development of kind of service user survivor leadership in research in terms of research projects. Uh, at the same time, I would say that I have kind of a particular set of values that I bring to the work and grounding in multi-generational experiences of schizophrenia. So in my case, I would say in some ways probably just growing up immersed in public mental health systems has maybe been even more influential for me than sort of just my own personal experiences. So I will just go ahead and dive in because this is a short presentation. So I decided to just focus on kind of three areas, phenomenology and meaning, which I think will align a lot in spirit with what Richard was just describing in terms of his dissertation. Power and coercion, kind of within mental health systems, and then social and structural determinants. In terms of how kind of lived experience informs this work beyond my own kind of immersive experience in the system and my family's, I think that my work is very much kind of animated and indebted to a lot of kind of qualitative and ethnographic engagement, and particularly with people who, to kind of use the disability justice phrase, I would describe as most impacted in the sense of material consequences of really kind of serious discrimination, disenfranchisement, social abandonment, if you will, because of SMI diagnoses. And so that includes, ending up on the street homelessness, incarceration, and criminalization within the legal system, poverty, unemployment, et cetera. And when I kind of think about what needs to change in the system, I'm always thinking first and foremost of people who kind of end up living under these kinds of conditions of, again, kind of social abandonment. So phenomenology and meaning, just to kind of start at the kind of intra-individual level, I think dominant approaches, and I would argue that this very much remains true even when there is sort of the rhetorical trappings of recovery orientation, trauma-informed care, et cetera, that in fact dominant approaches even within the early intervention and psychosis space really tend to kind of fixate on symptoms as the primary phenomena in question, and symptoms as reflective of either neuropathology or through a more psychological frame as maladaptive psychological processes. And that is communicated to service users when they enter services, and pretty kind of pervasively, I think, across different interventions and just kind of the informational materials, I think, that we distribute in services. And I would not say that that is particularly different in Australia or the UK or Canada, say, versus the US. What service users tend to encounter is often pervasive disbelief, obviously, sort of first and foremost about anything that is being described as psychosis, right? So it is understood by clinicians and by systems, by family members as representing delusional beliefs. But also often kind of claims more broadly related to the kind of the form and structure of experiences. In terms of the kind of meaning-laden qualities or experience of psychosis, I think this is another huge disconnect within the system. So very kind of reductionistic, whether it's reductionistic through a psychological lens or through a kind of more neurobiological lens, the meaning of experiences and the extent to which they matter not only to the individual, but matter in the sense of having and bearing larger collective meanings, it is often really kind of disregarded or simply not discussed, not acknowledged, not validated. And there's a lot of, I think, kind of reticence to do so on the part of clinicians, in part because of these sort of kind of pervasive clinical myths of such dialogues constituting a form of collusion or risking exacerbation of the kind of the quote unquote underlying psychosis. And then there's the whole kind of, elephant in the room often, I think, which is uh, what we describe as lack of insight or in a more biomedicalized frame, anosognosia in schizophrenia in particular, SMI more broadly. And that is, sort of this pervasive undercurrent of kind of clinical belief that people's sort of refusals to engage with treatment, with medications, refusal of the terms like schizophrenia, psychosis, mental illness, et cetera, right? That this represents a lack of insight that calls into question the capacity, the competency of the individual. And so when we think about kind of folks who are, again, I would describe as kind of most impacted, who are ending up in institutional and residential settings or on the streets, I think this is kind of pretty pervasive in what people are experiencing and in terms of the research that I do. In terms of folks who end up really, really disenfranchised from the system, I think it sort of kind of begins with this kind of fundamental refusal to kind of validate personhood and direct kind of first person claims to epistemic authority. And plays out as well in terms of, medications and how concerns about medications, concerns about side effects are often handled in real world practice. So that's sort of like level one. And then we can kind of move up, kind of from that to thinking about power and coercion within a broader frame. So again, if we kind of think about this sort of epistemic subjugation that occurs kind of first at the level of people's experiences and their direct claims to the truth and to the meaningfulness of what they're experiencing, there are then these more kind of overt power hierarchies that manifest in services. So one kind of aspect of that is medication reductionism. And this is not intended to be an anti-medication kind of sentiment. My concern is the way that a medication-focused or medication-centric frame overwrites often kind of everything else about people's experiences, especially in the context of schizophrenia treatment. And so, a lot of other aspects of kind of intervention and support really end up framed as secondary, tertiary, auxiliary, right? The central thing is medications. And I hear prominent psychiatrists all the time at conferences, not just in the US, right? Kind of really talk about how the primary thing then psychosocially we have to achieve is just medication adherence. Like medications really are the answer. And the problem then becomes service users' non-adherence to antipsychotics. So that whole frame, which is very pervasive, I think has really damaging consequences when it comes to, again, people, service users who don't agree with that frame, who don't understand their experiences in those terms. And this is sort of, I think, kind of major thing that pushes people away from services and away from engagement. Many forms of indirect coercion. So there's a lot of kind of indirect threats that people experience. And then, of course, explicit coercion, which in the context of first episode schizophrenia, we know from multiple studies from multiple countries, right, that experiences of explicit coercion, including involuntary hospitalization, forced injection, seclusion, and restraint, are more normative than not. And just in terms of initial pathways to care, never mind sort of people's multi-decade experiences of the system if they, if they continue to kind of to experience symptoms or disability. So this is very pervasive, and this really kind of structures a lot about, I think, kind of how a lot of people, but particularly those most disadvantaged, those most vulnerable, are often experiencing the system. And again, as I will kind of say in just concluding comments, right, I think this is a big area where we need change, and not just in the sense of kind of reducing seclusion and restraint, say, but like fundamentally rethinking the kind of the power dynamics, the carcerality built into the normative ways in which we tend to respond to schizophrenia in particular, but SMI more broadly. Social and structural determinants also often really drop out of research, of policy, of services. So in part, I think kind of a deeper engagement with social and structural determinants is a kind of a casualty of this focus on individual level solutions to individual level biological and psychological deficits, which again really pervades the field. It pervades research unquestionably. Hands down, any kind of major psychiatry journal you look at, you see overwhelming imbalance between a focus on individual level solutions, clinical trials, and the sort of the preoccupation with the biological, and to some extent kind of psychological. So we really neglect things like poverty, structural racism, and kind of other forms of social and societal disadvantage that kind of play out in constraining people's lives, and what it is possible for them to do and be. The responsibility of services to really actively intervene to ameliorate social disadvantage and social stratification is often actually outright questioned. As a researcher who most of my work focuses on this area, when I present at international conferences, almost inevitably, I will hear, kind of folks in the audience say things like, well, of course this is important, but it just really is outside of the kind of the realm of responsibility of mental health services. Or, we're there to address the symptoms. Of course, these societal problems exist, but they're kind of not our responsibility. And so kind of, I think, a deeper engagement with how entangled these things are at every level. So the extent to which, let's say, just kind of taking poverty as an example, shapes absolutely everything about people's experiences of the system, and their access to treatment, the quality of treatment they will receive, the forms that engagement takes or doesn't take, outcomes, absolutely everything. Content of psychosis, there's kind of research that's looked at that as well. And so that level of interentanglement is really not kind of dealt with. And then the question of kind of what is the responsibility then of services to actually kind of ameliorate the effects of these structural conditions. And things like socioeconomic mobility, actual socioeconomic mobility, or the ability, the capacity to live a life without poverty, are vanishingly rare in the psychosis research literature, right? We don't set them as targets for our services. And again, I would say, sadly, this is not just a US phenomenon. This is true if you look at the international literature. So we set very low goals in a way for people. So dominant supported employment strategies, for example, really fixate on any job, no matter how low the pay, no matter how exploitative the working conditions. The goal is just getting somebody a job, not really kind of thinking about what it really means to help move people out of poverty. I should just a time check. Am I still good on time? Yeah.
We've only got a couple of minutes and a couple of questions as well. Thanks.
Okay, so I can just very, very quickly wrap up, which is just to say that I think that there is a path forward, but we have to start doing things differently. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but measures and measurement is one way. What it is we're measuring in the context of research really, really matters. And what we set as the kind of outcome measures that are utilized to even, gauge whether something is a given intervention is effective or not. Provider training is a huge area. We have so much arguably over-focused in the context of evidence-based medicine on manualization and fidelity to intervention protocols that I think we have really lost sight of the need for kind of training and supporting clinicians to feel deeper empathy, attunement, understanding of the complexity and range of experiences of psychosis, humility, and really a deep level to kind of grasp power dynamics in services and how to kind of unwork those power dynamics. And then intervention, I think, really, really moving away from this very excessive, imbalanced focus on individual level interventions, especially those focused on kind of psychopathology narrowly, and also kind of really, really pivoting to interventions at a more kind of systems and organizational level that focus on sources of social abandonment, social exclusion, discrimination, etc. And I will, and then just kind of lived experience throughout, the complexities of lived experience not being allowed to drop out of research agendas. And I will just end there.